Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the subject of authority figures in movies, and how these authority figures are presented and who they're played by. Because there's a very interesting thing that comes up when you look into the biographies of these people, of the people who play authority figures. Because yes, there is a script that is written, which itself is often written by people who've never been an authority figure, which is related. But the people who play them imbue a lot. There's a lot in things like the way your face looks, your attitude, your physical body language, and so on, which is all under the direction of the actor. And one of the things that you'll find is if you look up the people who play authority figures, principals, teachers, often police, people in government workers, judges, and so on, these people don't have any experience being authority figures in real life. They often don't even have all that much experience with authority figures, except when they themselves were getting in trouble. A surprising number of these people turn out to be just goofballs. If you look up, in real life, what were they like, and so on. And they're often not at all authority figures. And then for the movies, they put on this very stern sort of tone, and they're really good at playing this very straight person who's very into, you will respect me, you will do what you are told, and so on. And what's interesting about this, one of the many things that's interesting about this, is that this is generally not what successful authority figures are actually like in practice. There will be times when an authority figure has to simply be stern, but this is atypical, in fact. This is not the common sort of thing. It is somewhat common in the experience of complete goofballs, because the complete goofball is a person who is, by their actions, put themselves well beyond the normal range of what is actually, reasonable for a person to do. They have demonstrated that they are not acting in a reasonable fashion. And so the authority figures in real life will often have to be stern with the people who are frequent, repeat offenders. The sort of people where you can't believe a word out of their mouth. They tell you, oh, I'm sorry, and they obviously don't mean it. And so when you know that the person, when you're an authority figure and you know that the person on the other end is lying to you all the time, that you can't trust anything that they say because it's been repeatedly demonstrated that they're just going to say anything to you in order to try to get out of trouble. They don't care about improving. They don't care about being better. They don't care about really anything at all except trying to escape the consequences at the moment. These are the people with whom you try to, if nothing else, you try to be stern maybe sometimes. Sometimes you are just keeping them at a distance where you're not engaging them. They're going to try to emotionally manipulate you, and you just need to get through the interaction. You want to shut down their attempts at emotional manipulation and just sort of be like, no, that's not happening. Look, this is what you did. These are the consequences. It's going to happen. Stop. And that is what a lot of these goofballs will bring to the portrayal of the authority figure. But it's very incorrect in the actual position of the positions of the characters within the fictional show, because these are, generally speaking, interacting with reasonable people who have done something wrong for the first time, people who may not have even done something wrong. And that's not how authority figures, at least competent authority figures, interact with people who have done something wrong for the first time. Now, a really good example of this is actually a movie called Roadhouse, which is a vastly better movie than it has any right to be. Patrick Swayze plays a bouncer, although not just a bouncer, he plays somebody who is in charge of bouncers, a cooler within the terminology of the movie. That is somebody who is in charge of the bouncers and sort of takes charge of the bar where there are too many fights and so on that goes on, and he helps to cool it down, to lower the temperature so it's much more just sort of an ordinary place of business where people are having a good time and not one where fights break out. So it's a fun movie, it's an action movie. Patrick Swayze plays a character who is competent at kung fu, but there's some very interesting parts. There's a bunch of philosophical things. It's not a movie for children, unfortunately, but there's some very interesting stuff, like the part where he's talking to this doctor who's stitching up. He had a knife wound, and he carries his medical records with him because this sort of thing does happen. And she looked it over and she joked, "Do you ever win a fight?" And he said, very sincerely, "Nobody ever wins a fight. Because by the time you've gotten to a fight, you can't win anymore. You can basically just avoid losing worse. And it's very true. By the time you have gotten to the point where you're now in a physical altercation where you and somebody else are trying to hurt each other into having your way, things have not gone well. And this gets really borne out in his advice as he takes over the bar within it. I played the clip, but for copyright reasons, unfortunately, I'm just going to recite it instead. I recommend, if you can, looking up the movie. It's a surprisingly good movie with some qualifications on that. But so he's talking to the bouncers and saying that things are going to get a lot better. And one of the bouncers says, "That sounds good, but I mean, some of the guys who come in here, we can't handle one-on-one, even two-on-one." And Patrick Swayze tells him, the character is Dalton, tells him, "Don't worry about it. Just follow these rules, and then everything will go okay." And then his rules are, 3 simple rules, I think I said. His rules are, expect the unexpected. So be prepared and go into every situation expecting that there are things that you don't realize, so leave yourself a margin of error, a margin of safety, and be constantly checking up on things that you may think you know. 2, don't start anything inside the bar unless it's absolutely necessary. If somebody, how'd it go? If somebody's causing trouble, ask them to walk. That actually is the important one. Don't start anything in the bar unless it's take it outside. Don't start anything in the bar unless it's absolutely necessary. And then rule number 3 is be nice. And then one of the bouncers goes, "Come on, I want you to be nice. I want you to remember that this is just a job. Now, if somebody's causing trouble, ask him to walk, but be nice. If he won't walk, walk him, but be nice. If you can't walk him, one of the others will help you, and you will both be nice. I want you to remember it's just a job, and then someone asks, you need to be nice until it's time to not be nice. Someone asks, well, how will we know when that is? You say, you won't. I will. I'll let you know. You're the bouncers, I'm the cooler. Just do what I tell you, watch my back and each other's, and take out the trash." And what's interesting about this is there's some things. One of the guys says, roughly, what if somebody insults my mother? And he said, well, is the insult accurate? And the basic point to the whole thing was that there's a lot you can accomplish by smiling. I actually made a video on that. We called it "What Can Be Accomplished by Smiling." But there's a surprising amount that actually can be accomplished by smiling. That is, by interacting with a person, being nice to them. It doesn't always work, and that's why there's rules number 1 and 2 about expect the unexpected, and don't start anything in the bar unless you have to. But when you're interacting with people in this authoritative role, and the bouncer is an authority in this thing, the first and most important rule to remember is to be nice. That is, to be pleasant in your interactions with people. Don't be threatening. To be approach them and talk to them in a friendly sort of manner. Because if you are friendly, that is to say, if you are acting like you are not a threat to them, they are much less likely to have a fight or flight reaction. They're much less likely to want to, to start defending themselves with their fists. They're much more likely to be able to think clearly because they're not afraid of what's about to happen. And so being able to de-escalate a situation, being able to make people feel comfortable, and then being able to explain to them what the situation is and what is in their interest, because at some point things could go badly for them. And so, what are the rules? What is their best bet in the circumstance where they're in? What are their options? Sometimes their options aren't pleasant, but they're still going to be the more pleasant and the less pleasant version of, what their options still are. So, in the context of that, you might, in a friendly way, explain to a person, look, you've broken the rules in a way where you're not allowed to still be here. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And a person can then either decide to walk out in a friendly manner, in which case there's probably the chance they'll be allowed back in, or they can start a fight. And there's a reasonable chance they're going to be beaten down because there are a bunch of big guys employed here to do that very thing. And moreover, if somebody starts a fight, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I went too far, I'll leave," they're probably not going to be allowed back in. So they'll be able to see, probably, if you approach them in a friendly way where their options are. Now, it doesn't always work, as I said, but it's a great place to start because you don't want to get into fights, as was noted, earlier, even in the movie. You don't win if you're in a fight. Even if you beat the other guy down and you're still standing, you haven't won in the situation. You may have, won the fight in the technical sense of you're standing and the other person isn't, but you probably took some sort of injury. I mean, it's really, really rare to be in any sort of fight with another human being and not get hurt in some fashion. They're going to land some punches or bites, or if they've got a knife, you're going to get cut, or, what have you. So, because the thing is, people don't start fights with people who massively outclass them. It just doesn't typically happen. You don't see a person who's, 5'1" and, 100 pounds if they're soaking wet with no training of any kind, who's just sort of a couch potato who decides they're going to really start a fight with a person who's, 6'8" and bench presses 450 pounds and could, pick them up one-handed, and has, a good, foot-long reach advantage on them. Like, a person doesn't start a fight in that circumstance. If the other person would take absolutely no damage from this fight, they're not going to start. And some drugs accepted. That's not typical. So if you're in a fight, you're probably going to get hurt from it, even if you, in some technical sense, win. And since your day is supposed to go along with you not getting hurt, you have lost in the sense of your day has gone a lot worse than it could. So as that authority figure, you want to try to make your day go the way it should. And so you start out friendly, you start out nice, you start out in such a way as to disarm a person, to keep them calm, and to help them to rationally see what is true and not true in the situation. So that's a really good example of that sort of authority figure. Another kind of authority figure, and now again, that's a very rare movie because it actually demonstrates this. The shows that the bouncer, this authority figure, is not a jerk, is not mean. His primary goal is not to get you to submit and respect his authority, but rather that his purpose is really, frankly, to get you to see reason, because reason's on his side. So if he can get you to see it, he's got a better day. Reason within the fact that there may be arbitrary rules, but if the arbitrary rules favor him, then you being reasonable about, what's going to happen in sort of the worst case, if you don't cooperate, is in the person's favor. Now, where this even comes far more, because many of us don't really come up against authority figures in that fashion very often, but we do in the context of things like working. Now, even people who work for themselves come up against authority figures in one form or another, be it, customers or, sometimes suppliers. Very, very often, though, people, even if they work for themselves, they don't work alone. And so they're still in some sort of authority position, one way or the other. Now, this sort of authority, the sort of authority you see at work, which is very, very common. We all, children have this with parents and so on. This sort of authority figure is especially badly represented in movies because they tend to like to use, the same sort of people tend to play these roles in the same way, which is the "you will respect my authority" type of authority, which is really very inappropriate to these things, for several reasons, but one of the biggest is in work situations and family situations. This is very much, if you're doing it at all correctly, the authority is themselves a servant to the people over whom they are an authority. This is granted a Christian ideal, but it also is the way in which things work out best. And if you look at, how does it work? When you've got a boss and you've got people who are working for the boss. Well, the boss is judged according to how well the team for which he is responsible performs. And so he needs to make sure that these people are able to do their best, because if they are simply slaves to him who are demoralized and barely get any work done, this goes badly. It might feel good in the moment. It probably wouldn't, frankly. At least for some people, it might feel good. It doesn't really, at least I've never had any attraction to that myself. The idea of like getting people to be some sort of acknowledging your greatness or something just doesn't have any appeal to me, frankly. But obviously it has to some people. This is a human phenomenon that has been observed. People do enjoy it. So it is possible that such a thing would feel good in the moment. However, these people are not going to actually get their work done very well, even if you leave out of account the issue of motivation. Motivation is incredibly important, but okay, you've got enough beatings or threats of firings or whatever that you can get people to work, through constant keeping them afraid. This is probably not going to work all that well and last all that long in a place where you have, where people can go and get different jobs, where people can quit and so on. But okay, you can, a tight job environment and so on, you manage to amass only people who have very, poor skill sets and so would have a very hard time finding a job elsewhere and so on. Which brings in its own problems. You can sort of make that sort of thing work for the motivation. But even if you could do it, even if you can keep the motivation up, the good old classic, the beatings will continue until morale improves, sort of jokes, you still have the problem that by imposing your vision, rather than getting the people to see how your vision is the best by collaboratively entering into it, explaining it, letting them see it, question it, answering their questions, until they agree with you that the vision that you have is in fact the right one, they don't understand what they're doing. And when they don't understand what they're doing, they're not going to be able to make the various choices involved in doing it well for the particular, in order for the vision. Because, of course, you can't explain the vision in words, all the details that matter in words. You can communicate in words what the vision is, and then when a person who also is, in touch with reality in their mind, has gotten the idea in their head of what the vision is, then they can answer these questions for themselves because they have a coherent idea in their head. And so then they can answer these questions, like all the little details that are involved in doing work, in a manner that is consonant with, whatever the shared vision actually is, because they too have it. As long as they don't have the shared vision, they can't. And so either they're going to have to constantly stop their work to ask you about every little detail, which is going to be hideously inefficient, or they're not, and they're going to come up with them according to something, very often whatever is easiest or whatever they think you're least likely to yell at them about, at which point that won't actually be consonant to the vision that you're working for, and so it's not going to work. So the point of this is that sort of managerial style that you see in the movies portrayed by these goofballs who don't know how to be an authority, which is a very adversarial type of managerial strategy, is a very bad managerial strategy. A good managerial strategy, sorry about that interruption, device started making a lot of noise. So as I was saying, what's portrayed is not a good managerial strategy for any sort of normal authority situation. What's described is actually basically the incredibly adversarial position of somebody who is dealing with a miscreant, with somebody who is just a serial rebel who doesn't want to be serial rebel, constant rebel, somebody who does not want to actually be working together with anybody. That's just not a good way to manage. In management is, moreover, if you're doing it well as opposed to the adversarial role, you're doing things like making sure that everybody knows what it is they're doing and, importantly, why they're doing it, what goal they're working towards, and how what they're doing fits into this goal. It is much, much easier to motivate people when you're doing this because they see what they're doing and how what they're doing is actually useful and beneficial and helpful to the world. They also can answer all of the little questions themselves, or at least most of the little questions themselves that come up, all the little details, because they understand what they're doing, what it's working towards, and so they can see, how all the little things will actually fit, so they can work much more on their own. They need far less in the way of direct micromanagement sort of things. Every now and then somebody will have a question that they'll, it's not so clear to them, so they'll need it to be answered. But it's much, much more efficient when they can exercise this. And they'll also enjoy it more because they see the benefit of it, and they're exercising some creative control because knowing what they're doing and why they're doing it, they can make good decisions. Moreover, there's a way in which, even if you're adversarial, you still need to be essentially a servant when you're a leader, because people need tools. The people who are working for you need tools, and even if you are on a chain gang, even if you're the police working a chain gang, breaking rocks in the hot sun, if somebody's pickaxe breaks apart, you still have to go get them a new pickaxe. They still need the tool to hit, and so if they're hitting rocks in the hot sun and then their tool breaks, well, guess who it is who's getting them a new tool? you're not going to, take them off the chain gang and say, just run off into the tool shed, get another one. Somebody is going to have to, who's in charge of the tools is going to have to make sure the thing is gotten in the proper way. That is to say, the people in charge, the authority figures, are going to have to serve the person who is underneath them. In the same way, you don't just hand out food, you don't just hand out water, because you have to feed people, you have to give them stuff to drink. And so, even in a prison, the people there who are in charge are still taking care of the people over whom they're in charge. Even when there is a measure of obedience, by the very fact of being in charge and the very fact that you're not going to let these people go and do anything, you have to do a lot for them. So, and that's an incredibly extreme example of the most, dysfunctional of human relationships here. In a functional human relationship, it is all the more the case that you have to go and make sure that people have what they need. And in point of fact, if you really want to be productive, if you want a productive team, you have to, you train people to come to you when they need something. And, and when I say train them, I mean, you are, you give them positive feedback. You praise them for when they do things like come to you and tell you that they need things, and come to you and tell you that they have problems and so on. Because this is in fact what you want them to do. You don't want to have to constantly go and ask them. But at the same time, the nature of it is you still occasionally just have to go and ask, because human beings being human beings, there's still, a hesitancy to go, and because you don't want to be the squeaky wheel. You don't want to be a complainer. And so the person in authority has to sort of counterbalance that with coming and asking, like, hey, is everything going right? Is there anything that can be improved? Can I help you with anything? And so it is the person in charge's job, in large part, to go and ask what people need and how things can be improved, to see what's going on and see where they might be able to help in virtue of the authority that they themselves have. So it's the nature of leadership in a proper sense that all leaders are servants in a real sense, even in the most degenerative cases. But if they the more functional the relationship is, the more the leader is a servant to the people whom he leads. And so this is the sort of thing that you just don't see in Hollywood movies, especially because none of the people involved, from the screenwriters over to the actors, have any idea of what real leadership looks like. The director may, because a director is a leader and a director needs to do it, but the thing is, at least based on how Hollywood represents itself, it tends to be pretty pathological, what Hollywood is like. And so they're used to dealing with very, very strange people, rather than, functional human relationships. And in any event, much of what they're filming is determined by the actor and by the screenwriter, not really so much by the director. So in total, if you watch Hollywood movies, you tend to get a very, very skewed and inaccurate sense of what authority actually looks like in normal human relationships. And so it's interesting to sort of peek behind the curtain and see this, and see the degree to which it's not really representing reality. And that doesn't mean to not watch movies, they're good movies and so on, but it does mean to be aware of it and to see, where do movies do things well and where do movies do things badly. And to be aware of that is to help inoculate yourself from the mistakes that are coming in as subtext, because how the actor, the body language and the tone of voice and things like this are all subtext below the text. And so it's really easy for anything that is assumed to just take the things that are assumed as true. And that's why it's especially important to be able to see them and to recognize them. And it can often help to laugh at them. But that helps to inoculate yourself against taking these assumptions as errors, and instead just sort of letting them go by. And, it's an imperfect world, and all the entertainment that you see is going to be imperfect. So let that go by and focus on only the good parts and learn only the parts that are true from what you're seeing. So, and similarly, to see it like, okay, this is a sort of normalish person in a very pathological circumstance. And that was, that's the point of a comedy like Office Space, where the boss is sort of intentionally being one of the worst bosses you could possibly find. And that's, it's played up to the point where you can see it. So, in Office Space, that's where, the boss doing things terribly and so on is by virtue of being played for laughs, something that you know is not the way a boss is really supposed to be. It's nor is it nor are you really going to take this as how an underling is supposed to relate to their boss. That it's supposed to be a different sort of relationship, and a much more mutual, much more open one, and so on. But in movies that are not primarily that, where they're not calling out, not calling out, but not hanging a lampshade on the fact that what they're portraying is completely dysfunctional humanity. It can often, they often even show it as if it is somewhat functional humanity. Like the one that really comes to mind is in The Breakfast Club, the principal who's a terrible character in the sense of not so much in the sense of badly written, but in the sense of he is a well-written example of a terrible person. Everything he does is about himself, and nothing of what he does is about the people for whom he does it. He had some vague idea that he would, within the description, the character had some vague idea that he would be helping young people because he would tell them something and then he would just go do it. And when that didn't work, because that's not how human beings in a fallen world work, he didn't know what to do. He had no idea. He was completely, flustered, and ceased to be a good leader in any sense whatsoever, and just sort of nursed his grievance over how much his ideal of he would say things and everyone would just sort of, get it right automatically didn't work. And so his life was all about this grievance that he had rather than being a leader. So it's sort of an interesting example, and to some degree that was the point of the character in the movie. It's just it wasn't universally portrayed as that. The movie did not show him as being a particularly awful character, of being an unusually bad person. It sort of portrayed him more or less as a typical person, and then showed how terrible he was, which is still one of the problems that you'll see. It'll give you a very skewed perspective when it's not shown just how terrible he is. And there's a little bit of this, just a little bit of it, when the principal's talking with the janitor. But the thing is, the janitor doesn't really react to the principal in the right way. He doesn't react to him as being as strange as he is. He reacts to him as if he's normal, but just points out what's wrong with him. He doesn't react to him as if the guy's really got some problems, which he does. He reacts to it as if really having these sort of massive problems and being this bad at what he does is just kind of normal. And that's the sort of thing that is very dangerous, because that's, again, the subtext. That it correctly identifies what's wrong, but it rather misidentifies how typical this is, how normal it is. That sort of error is the sort of thing that people will fall into from time to time. It's not the sort of thing that they will tend to typically get wrong all the time. There are bad bosses, just sort of wrap up, people who just do this completely badly. They are typically the people who, like the principal in that movie, have some vague notion of the idea of how authority works. And it's all about, I tell you something and then you just go and implement it perfectly. And then when that doesn't work, they have no idea what to do. And they're terrible, terrible leaders. And you will find these people in jobs. You'll find people where, the boss thinks only about himself. You'll find radically selfish people. They make especially bad bosses, though they're bad at pretty much everything. And they exist. They are the sort of people you need to just get as far away from as you can, because when they are that broken, when they are that focused on themselves and nothing but themselves, when they are that focused on just not thinking reasonably, not thinking about anything, they don't act within their own self-interest, they don't act within other people's interests, they just have like one idea and they're going to beat you to death with it, and it's a particularly bad idea. Though there's nothing to do with those sorts of people, you just need to get away from them. And then, as they fail progressively, eventually they'll get fired, and they'll get another job, and they'll get fired from that, and they'll develop a bad enough record that everybody stays away from them. And more or less, the only thing you can do in a fallen world is stay away from the really damaged people. Occasionally you can help them, a lot of the times you can't. And when you can help them is when you are in a position of authority over them. That's the other big thing, that it is or at least a position of equality. You often can do only a little bit, But when you're in a position of authority or a position of equality, you can sometimes help these people a little bit, sometimes not. Some people, and this is sort of where you get into the doctrine of hell, some people are just determined to follow an idea no matter how bad it is, and will not ever consider that following terrible, terrible ideas is a, well, bad idea. And that's when you really are dealing with a person like that, there's nothing to do but try to get out of their way and not let them beat you to death with their one idea. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.